Today we have New York Times and USA Today best-selling author Michelle Gable here as a guest. We're so excited to have you, Michelle, talk about your newest release that just released this week. And it is The Bookseller Secret. And I just saw it at the bookstore today. I thought,
nice.
Phil, I'm having her on the show. That's so awesome. So please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you for having me, Erin, and thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Michelle, and The Bookseller Secret is my fifth novel. My first novel was called A Paris Apartment, and a few in between, and I live in San Diego, in Cardiff by the Sea, technically, but it's part of San Diego. I worked in finance for 20 years before retiring to write full-time. There was a little bit of overlap where my first couple books came out, I was still working full-time and trying to balance it all. And I have two teenage daughters, a dog and a cat, and a husband too.
Oh, that is awesome. So The Paris Apartment, great book, by the way. Thank you for sending me a signed advanced copy. Super excited to read this. I'm a huge historical fiction buff. I guess, is that the category we put this in?
I think so. Even though all my books kind of have the dual timeline with a modern day and a historical, I consider it historical fiction.
I do too. I love to, and what's funny is the list that you sent me of your favorite books, I read most of those too. So I know, I'm like, okay, makes sense. That's
exactly.
So where did you, okay, so I have to go back because fascinating. You've been writing since fourth grade. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So my parents, for my 10th birthday, they gave, I was a huge reader. I was one of those kids that would like chuck out 20 books in the library and then have to go back the next day. And I also loved to write, and my parents saw that in me. So my dad, I used to say, the story was my dad gave me a book for my 10th birthday called Someday You'll Write. But then my mom heard me tell this story a few times. She's like, excuse me. Because, everyone knows it's like the mom buys the present for the dad to give to the kid. So she's like, let it be known that I gave the book. And so, and it was kind of funny when my first book came out, they still had the book, like the actual book, and it had been chewed up by a dog. And my mom had scripted it. And it says, Michelle, congratulations on your first novel. I knew when I gave you this book, like she just wanted to make sure. So from that point on, I just wrote all the time. I'd write these. I don't think I really thought I was going to be a writer per se. I just liked to do it. And I'd write short stories and novels and all sorts of horrible, horrible things. My parents still have some of these in their closet. It's very embarrassing. But and then I graduated high school, and I grew up in San Diego as well, but I went to school on the East Coast. I went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I majored in accounting, as aspiring writers like to do. I knew that I liked to write, but I also knew my parents weren't going to support me. I needed to pay the bills, and I genuinely love finance and accounting and numbers. So it was easy. It was an easy pick for me because I didn't really feel like I was giving up anything and I could still write. And all that time I was just writing and writing and writing and just not really having any specific plan. And then it was the night of my 31st birthday. I told my husband, I think I'm going to do something with this writing. I think I'm going to try to find an agent, get published. And to make a very long story short, I eventually got an agent, and that book didn't sell. And then I wrote another book, and that book didn't sell. And I kept writing books, but I was like, that's fine. I'll just keep writing another book and another book and another book after that. And if I'm 85 when my first book comes out, I'll be very seasoned. I'll be very experienced, and that's fine. So finally, after many, many failures, including a failed auction and a bunch of other road bumps, we ended up selling A Paris Apartment, and it came out a few weeks before I turned 40. So I got the book when I turned 10. I made this pronouncement when I turned 31, and then the book came out a few weeks before I turned 40. So quite the long journey. And that book did well right out of the gate. So it was a nice way to start things off.
Okay. Wow. So 31, you started writing. Is that when you started looking for an agent and things like that?
Yeah, I'd already written some books, but that's when I kind of was like, okay, I'm going to focus on a book, make it. I really studied the business. Like, how do you get an agent? How do you get the manuscript to be the best it can be? I polished up a manuscript starting around that time, and then looked for an agent and went from there.
So 9 years, you just kept going and didn't give up.
Mm-hmm. And I should say my agent also didn't give up, because I signed with her in about, it was January 2008. I signed with my agent, and we sold A Paris Apartment in May of 2013, and it came out in 2014. So she worked for me, and they don't get paid till you get paid. So she basically worked for me for 5.5 years without payment. And I kept telling her, you can fire me. Like, I know you're not doing this for fun. And she, she believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself at times. And actually my 5th book, The Bookseller Secret, my new book, is dedicated to her.
I wondered, okay, so that is amazing. So when you, for 9 years, you just kept going regardless. I mean, were there times you wanted to give up? I mean, that is a long time.
Yeah, there were times when it was right before I came up with the idea for a Paris Smart. So I just had this attitude of, I'll just write a better book and a better book and a better book after that. And it helped that I had a very busy career. I was an executive. By this point, I was an executive at a big publicly traded company, and I had 2 daughters. And my husband is a CFO of a biotech. We didn't have a nanny or anything. It was a lot of juggling and so I was able to kind of ignore the fear and the doubts and all that kind of stuff because so much was going on. And actually there was one manuscript and we were going to go to auction with it, which is a good thing. That means like multiple people want it. And then on the day of the auction, one by one, every editor dropped out. And that's never happened to my agent before or since. And it was because this was very bad timing. It was 2010 and the market was really bad. And they said, we're just not going to do debut authors right now. They're too hard to sell. We're only going to do the sure things. Now, of course, now being a debut author is very sexy and exciting. But in 2010, the market was not great. We were still recovering from the financial disaster. And so they were like looking for their, James Pattersons and their, their bankable names. And they said, a debut author is just too hard to sell. And as you can imagine, that was when my confidence really plummeted. Because I was like, well, how am I going to get over that hump? Like, do I need to go on a reality show or commit a crime or something? So at that point I was like, I don't even know where to go from here. Like, do I just focus on my finance career, which was going well. And I loved it. It wasn't like one of those things where I'm just slogging away, hoping to one day make it as I loved my job. And it was shortly after that I went to Paris for work, and my agent had seen once again, it's like she's been so critical and in every step of the way. She'd seen an article about an apartment in Paris that had been found. A woman died in the south of France. She was 90 years old. And when they went through their estate, they found out she had an apartment in Paris that she'd locked up 70 years before and never returned. And it was just filled like floor to rafters with unimaginable treasures, artwork, furniture, just glorious pieces. And central to this was like a $2 million painting by Boldini. It was just gorgeous. If you Google, it's on my website as well, but if you Google, Paris apartment abandoned or what, you'll see images and it's just stunning. And my agent's like, I think it's because I was in Paris that made her think of me, of course, and also because I was making her $0. But she sent it to me and said, like, I think you can write about this. And that's what I did. And that was my first book. So it was kind of good timing in that sense when I was at my very lowest.
That was actually one of my first books I ever read of yours a long time ago. And I, for some reason didn't connect the two until you said that just now. And I'm like, I love that book. And I just now realized, oh my gosh, that was that book. Oh, wow. Okay. So Paula said the Mitfords are a very interesting family.
Yes.
Yes. So this book where did you get the inspiration behind The Bookseller Secret? And for those of you watching, I linked it down below. You can check it out. You can actually buy it and download it right now on your Kindle or your ebook, whatever device you have, or you can just grab the paperback, and it's a beautiful book. What was your inspiration behind that?
Once again, my agent helped me out with this. So Nancy Mitford, all my books are a dual timeline narrative, as I mentioned at the beginning. And so the historical piece is about Nancy Mitford, the writer. And I'm actually shocked how few people know about Nancy Mitford, considering I read her in college. So this is my favorite book of hers, The Pursuit of Love. And that's Nancy on the cover. And they just released an Amazon Prime series based on this book like a couple weeks ago. So definitely, we'll read this book first because it's one of the best books I've ever read. Her writing is very sharp and funny and insightful. It's a little biting at times. Her sister would always say that being beastly was her favorite sport. And I've always loved her writing. And I and then I really fell in love with the whole Mitfords, as was it Paula who mentioned it?
Yes.
That when I read this book called The Sisters, and it was about the 6 Mitford girls, and this came out about 20 years ago, and I highly recommend this. It's by Mary S. Lovell, The Sisters, and it you can see this is a very big book, and there's quite a lot to say about these these sisters. And there was one brother, poor thing, but they lived this kind of, their dad was a baron, and they lived in this rambling old crumbled down manse. So Nancy Mitford was part of the Bright Young Things, which was a group of aristocrats in the 1920s London, and they were kind of bohemian, but they were aristocrats. They, had titles and all this kind of stuff. So it was that push pull and like, oh, we're art, we're artsy and bohemian and all this stuff, but like they came from a very storied background. And these girls grew up in this manse. It was freezing. It was kind of one of those things where they had the title and the land, but they had like no money, and the girls would sell their chickens' eggs on the road for extra money, and they would run wild. And the dad didn't believe in educating girls. He just thought they needed to like know how to ride a horse and speak French, and they would get up to their own devices and horrify the neighbors. And the dad would do child hunts where he would send dogs to chase them across the Cotswolds. And it would be like a Sunday morning, and these people are going to church, and you see these like little blonde girls like running across chasing them. So they grew up in this very interesting environment, and they all grew up to be they were notoriously beautiful, these 6 girls, and they also grew up to be very notorious. So it's hard to remember 6 sisters, but I can break it down to you. Of course, they're more complicated than this, but here's just a quick summary, and you will see why Paula said they were so interesting. So you have Nancy the novelist, who's the center of my book, and she's the oldest. And then you have Deborah the Duchess, Diana the fascist, Decca the communist, Unity the Hitler confidant, and then you have Pamela, who's just Pamela. She's a little bit boring, but she has her own interesting things going on as well. So just completely, you have opposite sides of the spectrum who politically. Nancy reported on her sister that was a fascist during the war. She ended up in jail during the war because of her sympathies towards Hitler. So and the mom used to joke, although I don't think it was a joke, every time she'd pick up a newspaper and it read Pierre's daughter, ... She's like, okay, what did one of my daughters do this time? And it was just, they were constantly in the news. So they were very, very controversial, very interesting. One of the, sister, the communist, moved to the United States eventually. She was best friends with Maya Angelou. So it's just, the stories can go on and on. You could write a book about each of them. And so I knew that I've always kind of wanted to write something about Nancy Mitford, or just the Mitfords in general, because they're so interesting. And it was similar to my last book, which was about an affair that JFK had with a woman named Alicia Corning Clark and a love child they may have or may not have had. So it's a similar thing. I'd always wanted to write about the Kennedys. I just needed to find the right story. And this is a similar thing. Like I'd wanted to write about the Mitfords, but you can't just like, I write fiction. I don't just write a biography or a timeline of events. You need to have a story arc and a beginning, middle, and end and all that. So I was struggling with what to write for my 5th book. And I really I had written this book about a Nevada brothel in the Old West, but publishers were like, oh, can you do like World War II instead? Like, well, Old West is really hard. It's really too tough. People don't like it. Like, can you go back to Paris, World War II? And I was getting kind of grumpy about it. And I said something to my agent, like, okay, fine. I'm going to write about a bookshop in World War II. I'm going to have high society in there and maybe some orphans. And my agent goes, actually, did you know that Nancy Mitford, and she knew I liked Nancy Mitford. She said, did you know Nancy Mitford worked in this bookshop during the war? And I'm like, no, I did not know that. Or if I did know it, I just didn't remember it. Yeah. And she's like, yeah, I think that could be an interesting, starting off point. I'm like, oh, you're right. And what was even more interesting is when she was working there, The Pursuit of Love, which is the book that I mentioned, was her book that made her famous. And that came out right after the war. But while she was working in the bookshop, she was also struggling with what to write for her 5th novel. And I was struggling with what to write for my 5th novel. So it all seemed so perfect. And then the modern day storyline has a writer who's also struggling. And so she kind of expresses her life is very different from mine, a very big mess, but she kind of expresses some of my writerly angst in her storyline. And she goes to London to stay with a friend and discovers all these little things about Nancy Mitford. And and the story comes together in this bookshop that still exists today.
Have you been?
I haven't, and I've probably walked past it because I've been to Mayfair so many times, so I can't believe I haven't been in it. And they supply like books to the Queen, like they're very well known. And I wanted to go, of course, but world conditions did not allow that.
Right.
You can Airbnb and stay in the bookshop, by the way, for anyone that wants to make that adventure.
Okay, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. So
wow. Okay, so that was one of my questions I had for you. Have you traveled a lot to Europe?
I have. So in my day job, I travel quite a bit to Europe. I've gone to Paris many times before I wrote a Paris apartment. Like I said, I got the idea. My agent sent me the idea while I was physically in Paris. And of course, I have to travel, for Rome was featured briefly in my last book. So of course I had to go to Rome. But I've traveled to, I spent a good deal of my career traveling to London, Paris, Milan, a little bit Munich, and a few other places. Like I used to go to Guernsey a lot, which is kind of random. So I've been lucky in that sense.
Wow, that is awesome. So one of the things I loved in your bio is you talk about how you wrote I'll See You in Paris almost by hand at your kids' events, like soccer games, things like that. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think a lot of people are closet writers and trying to grab those little bits of time to kind of fuel their passion. And what was that like for you in that time?
That's what I had to do, because that's when I was working full time. My daughters were not yet at the age where they could drive or be on their own. I mentioned we didn't have a nanny. So it was their softball games. And, any kind of sport, like you had to get there an hour and a half for warm-ups. It's not really enough time to do anything. So and sometimes I just don't feel like lugging my computer. And also computers can be distracting. So I would just handwrite, as much as I could write in between. Luckily, softball is also kind of a slow game, like in between innings, like the whole, I swear half the people thought I was asked this constantly. Oh, are you a teacher? Like people thought I was grading papers or something. I got asked that constantly. And actually, I ended up liking the process, and I'll still write by hand sometimes, especially if I need to really focus or I don't feel like bringing my computer somewhere. Sometimes you don't want to bring it to a ball field and it's kind of hard to read the screen, or you don't want to leave it in your car when it's a million degrees. So it is, like you said, it was sneaking time. It'd be sneaking time in the pickup line. Sometimes you have to get there early, because if you get there like 5 minutes before school starts, you're in this horrific line. So you need to get there 20 minutes. Any mom can relate to that. And so it was that book was for sure written in stealing bits and pieces of time. And you'd be surprised how much you can get done in little chunks of time.
So when people would ask you, are you a teacher? Would you tell them you're writing a book?
Yeah, because by that point I did have one book out. But it would be kind of funny, because at that point, like I said, I was still working. Most people knew me from that, and they'd be like, I thought you worked in finance. I'm like, I do. But I also, they're like, is it a finance book? That sounds horrible. I'm like, no, this is a novel. They're like, okay. Yeah. And I remember, they used to play volleyball too, and they would be in between games, and I would go in this little like snack bar area that had a seated area, and it was indoors, and the parents would come up and talk to me. I'd be like, I'm trying to work. I'm sure they thought I was so rude, but I'm like, I'm trying to work, you guys. I'm sorry, I can't talk right now. I really need to. And I
can't talk right now. I'm doing author things.
Yeah, and I was on a contract too, so I had a deadline. It wasn't just me being like, hopefully this book will sell. At that point, I had a contract for that book, so I'm like, I really need to finish. I'm sorry. So yeah, that book was such a stealing as much as I could, in line at ball fields and all that.
What are you working on now? Do you have anything in the works?
Yes, I'm almost done with my 6th book. And even though I said no more World War II, this takes place in Rome toward the end of the war, which I love. Rome is my favorite city, probably even more than Paris and London. And it takes place at the end of the war, and it's based on a woman, although I've completely fictionalized her, a woman that worked for the OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA. And she worked for the OSS just creating propaganda for the Germans. So they would send out the propaganda to the soldiers to try to lower. It was called morale operations, and their whole point of their existence was to lower morale. So it's kind of a study on like how propaganda. I mean, it's a novel. It's not like a study in that sense, but it tackles friendship, and then it also tackles the idea of like what propaganda does to not only the people you're putting the propaganda onto, but if you're the one creating the propaganda, and at what point are you believing your own lies or not believing your own lies? So
when's your publish date for that?
I think it's like October or November of next year, I think, around there.
Wow. That's exciting.
Yeah. So that book's been really fun and easy to write. I don't know what's been so easy about it, but I've had a lot of fun with it.
Do you work on one at a time, or do you kind of have a bunch that you have in the queue?
Generally, I work on one at a time, but right now I'm actually co-writing another book with an author. Oh. And so we're still working on the proposal, and the proposal has like, I don't know, I think we have like 10 chapters or something in the proposal. So, it's not a full book yet, but we have the synopsis and all that kind of stuff and going back and forth. So I am working on that as well. And I didn't even realize that all my characters, because I was finishing up copy edits for the Bookseller Secret. I was working on my Rome book and then doing this co-writing project, and all the main and two of the main characters are real, people, Nancy Mitford and this woman named Nettie. And I'm like, all my characters have end names. And then it's like Nikki in the other book. I'm like, okay, I got to remember. And it's just by chance. I'm like, I got to remember who I'm thinking of and like their voice, because it's all very different.
Very different. You have 3 very different things there. Is it, Paula had a question. Is it difficult to write with another author?
No, not so far. Like I said, the whole book's not done. We're probably about 20% done with it. It's been, it's an idea that I've been batting around for a long time. And and I needed a different voice, because it's about the Hannibal Hamlin, who was Lincoln's first vice president. He was an abolitionist, and he was replaced with Andrew Johnson. And like, I think that this country would be better off if he had still been in office when Lincoln was assassinated. So it's back and forth. And I wanted a Black voice on the modern day storyline, and I'm doing the historical. So I needed to find the right partner for the project. And it's actually my agent, once again, introduced me to this author. And so because we're writing such distinct parts, mine is historical, hers is modern day, it's a little bit it is a little bit easier. I know co-authors that like they write the whole thing together. So there's no, if they're not just 2 different voices, it's just one story, then I would imagine that'd be a little bit harder. But I guess if you have enough trust in each other, I mean, we definitely comment on each other's stuff, but I don't go in there and anything I comment in hers is not, because I don't want to mess with that voice, and she doesn't, because it's so different. It's modern, where mine is historical. So I think it would be more difficult if you're trying to just have one story, one voice, and keep that voice consistent through the whole thing. I think that would be a challenge.
Are you able to say who you're working with yet, or no?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, that's really exciting, and that sounds like a fascinating idea. I can't wait to see more about that one. That's pretty cool.
Fingers crossed. We haven't sold it yet or anything, but we've been working really hard on it. It's this idea I've been batting around for 5 or 6 years, something crazy, and just trying to find the right outlet, the right storyline, the right partner, and all this kind of stuff. So fingers crossed.
That is amazing. What advice would you have for an aspiring writer?
Just write. That's all you can do. And it's, I would say write every day, but that's not always possible. But at least be consistent about it, because the hardest thing is just starting. Like opening the file is the hardest part. And that's why I always finish writing when things are going well and I don't want to stop. That way, when I start the next time, I'm in the middle of something and I don't have to look at a blank page. So that's my little hack. But it's just, I really think the difference between, and if aspiring writer is an aspiring published writer, I really think the difference is just perseverance. It's constant rejection. It's even rejection when you get, my books have sold well. They're, New York Times bestsellers. And then, people are like, oh, we don't want your brothel book because it's the market's too weird. So
I thought it sounded really good.
Yeah, I think it's very good, but okay. But so, it is that kind of industry where it's like more rejection than not at a certain level. So I think it's just persevering and believing in yourself and reading. I mean, reading is key. I don't think you can be a writer unless you're a reader first. So that is huge.
Did you ever consider during those 9 years to just self-publish?
No, I didn't really. I mean, when I first started out, it wasn't as big of a deal wasn't as mainstream as it is now. And also I think self-publishing, first of all, it seems like a lot of work. Like you have to be your own general contractor. You need to find your cover design, your interior. I mean, just if you look at, this book is very pretty. It's very pretty. The covers, even the interior pages, how they, lay up the page, everything. Figuring out a copy editor, a regular editor, like that felt overwhelming to me. And, when you go with a publisher, you get a very small, it's like whatever, 10 to 15% is like your royalty rate, which isn't a lot. You think like, I wrote this whole book, but then they're doing all the rest. That's why you have to make that trade-off. So if you're someone that thinks like, I would love to figure out the cover and the copy editor, then maybe that is the right path. And I also think it's better for somebody that maybe has like a few books in the hopper. Like say you wrote 3, rom-coms or whatever. Like if I were ever to self-publish, I would want to have like 3 books in the hopper, because people that like to read on ebooks and things, I think like to have a little bit more books. Like they find an author and they want to read more by that author, and they tend to be very fast readers that get a lot of books, and they're like the biggest bibliophiles who read series and things like that, and they get through those books and they want more. So I do feel like if you're going to self-publish, you need to like have a few books in the hopper. So if the first one gets traction, it's just, you have to approach it like a full business. And also when I started, I was working full time. I didn't have time for all that. So I didn't want to have to worry about marketing my books or figuring out a cover or any of that. So to me, that was just never an option. And I also don't think my books are right for that. Now, if I was going to suddenly try to write some like rom-com or romance, I might think about like, okay, could I do this on my own? And there's more resources now to explore that avenue.
Interesting. You said something and I was like, I'm going to ask her that when she's done, but now I can't remember. But what are you, I'll try to remember. What are you reading right now?
What am I reading? I am reading We Are the Brennans. It was my book of the month pick from last month, I think it was. Yeah. So, and I just finished, it was such a fun book. I just finished Dial A for Aunties. I can't remember Jesse Quintano, I think, or something like that. If you just want a book that's going to make you crack up and laugh and feel happy, then I cannot recommend that enough.
We Are the Brennans is on my TBR as well. So
I'm not that far. I'm like 100 pages in, but it's very good so far.
Well, I'm talking to her publicist right now. I'm trying to get her on my show.
Oh my gosh.
So that is fun. Yeah, that's why I'm like, I really want to read that. And I have so much I want to read. There's just so much. Only a little time in the day. I'm actually a really fast reader though.
Same here.
Have you ever read, this is a book that is similar in your genre, The Kitchen Front by Jennifer Ryan?
I'll have to.
So I thought of that book when you were talking about Rome, because it goes into World War II. I think you'd really like it.
Yeah. And, okay, I'll check that out.
And I'm also trying to have her on the show too.
Like a newer book, like was it recently out?
I think in the past year, yeah. And it has a really pretty title, a pretty cover. It's like a woman with like a red apron.
Okay.
And it takes place in World War II, and one of the characters in it was Italian. So I thought of you when you said that. So
my gosh, I'll definitely check that out.
A book that I read that kind of stuck with me. Like sometimes, when you are just folding laundry and you think of something and you're like, oh yeah, that book. The ones that linger a little bit.
Yes.
And kind of like yours, like you're still going, what the heck? Wow, there was like so many twists and things going back and forth. And just a book that really kind of stuck with you. You might like that one too. And also Michelle shared some of her favorites that she's read recently, and we link those down below if you guys want to check those out too. She had some really great ideas. In fact, some of those I loved Erin French. Wasn't that a great book?
Oh my gosh.
Didn't you just want to go eat every time she described things?
And I'm not a foodie. Like I cook because my kids need to eat, and it's like, come on, guys! I just fed you yesterday again. No. But
why do they want dinner every day?
It made me want to like go work in her kitchen. I'm like, wait, no, I hate cooking. Like it was so beautifully done. I love that book. I want to go there so badly. It was gorgeous.
We went to Alaska a few weeks ago, but for a minute, I was thinking about Maine. I was like, we could just fly in. We could go to that restaurant. And my husband's like, what is this restaurant? And we ended up going to Alaska, but I really considered it. I really wanted to go there after reading that book. Yeah. And then let me see what else you shared. That you had some really great reads on there. Island Queen.
That was a great
one. The Guncle. That's a fun
That's fun.
one. Yes. And then of course the Rose Code. That was an amazing book too. So
she's a good friend of mine, and of course I love all her books.
So I know I always ask this and authors always kind of roll their eyes, but do you have a favorite child? Which book was your favorite?
That's tough because there's so many different, like, there's things I like about different books. Because the Book of Summer was the easiest for me to write. So I really love that book so much. Like, I just feel, and then I'll See You in Paris. I just feel I love those characters so much.
Yeah.
You know, people love A Paris Apartment, but that was my first book and it was very traumatic, the whole experience. So I think that, like my editor got fired before the book even got published. I mean, there was just a lot going on. And I also, because I didn't know, I mean, I just felt like I don't know anything, but what's really cool is that, you know, she got fired before my book came out and her assistant was like very helpful for me. And now her assistant's an editor and she was my editor for this book. So she worked on my first book and then this most recent one. So that was kind of cool. So that book is like a little bit, people love that book, but you know, for me, I get like a little, but I have a warm spot too.
You're like PTSD. You're like, yeah. That was rough. That was really rough.
Like people be like, I love that book. I'm like, really? You do? I don't know. I just have this like block about it. But then I also
be like, thank you. I worked so hard.
I also have a warm spot in my heart for it because it is my first, you know. And then this summer I met Jack. That was like that was hard because it's my longest book by far. And that was hard with all the research. I mean, I read 2,000 articles. I read over 200 books to do that. And so that was hard, but it was like rewarding in that way of like when you do accomplish something. My daughter just walked in. Hi. When you do accomplish something really hard. And then this book was also hard because I wrote it, you know, entirely like during the beginning of the pandemic toward, you know, the end of last year. So there was that aspect of it. Although there was that parallel where, you know, Nancy's living in London and there's a war going on and they're going out to dinner and taking their gas masks. And there's all this stuff going on, but they're still trying to live normal lives and kids are trying to go to school, but there's a war on. So I'm like, well, you could kind of relate on that level of like, where at a certain point, you're just trying to like get through your day and do normal things. So
as an author, I think we think, oh, well, you were at home so much, you could just hole up and write books, right? But then you don't really think about like the mental health aspect and the emotional health and how that really bears so much heaviness on all of us. How was that like for you? Was that just a super heavy time? Was writing an escape, or was it hard to write during that time?
It could be both. I mean, it was good in that I didn't have to worry. It was nice not worrying about what kid needs to be where, when, and like, do I need to go watch 7 softball games this weekend, and when am I going to write? So, and because my deadline was so tight, it was nice that I knew I could only worry about that. But then, you know, you have everybody at home and I can work anywhere. As you know, I could write in my car, but you know, one of my daughters took over my office. My husband's downstairs. My other daughter's in her, you know, so I was like writing in my room, which I don't love. And like you said, then that mental space, I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody can relate where you just suddenly start crying. I mean, I was lucky no one close to me was affected, but it was still the weight of the world. And I will say, I remember texting my best friend and being like, I can't just like meditate my way into this. I can't just meditate a book. Like, cause I can't just meditate. I just be like, okay, I'm going to go meditate. That's how I'm going to center myself. And I just kept doing so much meditation that I'm like, okay, I mean, meditation's good, but this is not right. It's not writing a book. Like you can't just meditate a book into existence. So it was really hard to, in that thing, but I'm pretty good about hyper focusing on one thing, because people would think when I had my 2 jobs, oh, you must be good at multitasking, but that's not it. I'm good at like hyper focusing and like whatever I'm doing, I'm all in, and then I can switch tasks really quickly. So if I'm with the kids, I'm all in, well, except for when they're warming up, then I'm writing a book. But you know, I can just switch tasks. So if I can get in the right headspace, I can just kind of tune out the world. And I did try to put in some of that like frustration of what's happening, you know, into Nancy and her feelings about the war going on around her. So I did try to think of it like, okay, well, I can channel some of this angst, and because I mean, I imagine living in the middle of where you're literally having raid sirens interrupt your dinner party, you know, I could imagine like just sometimes feeling so overwhelmed by that, and then other times being able to pretend it's almost not happening. So I kept trying to remind myself, like, channel it into that, channel it into the book, channel it into the book. So it was hard, but there were some scheduling aspects that made it easy. But it was very challenging. I mean, it was very, very hard to write. And I think any author you would interview would echo the same sentiment.
You can feel it doing the interviews when we talk about the past 2 years.
Yeah.
It's heavy. It's really heavy. And so many people handled it in so many different ways. We all just did the best we could, you know?
And sometimes I would feel like, what am I? I'm just writing, like, I'm just making stories up. Like, who cares? Like, this is so pointless. Like, why am I doing this dumb job? You know, like, I would almost feel like this is frivolous, I guess you could say. But then I'm like, well, Michelle, you also take great refuge when you read books. So how can you say, if there were no books for me to read, I would be no, I could not imagine a life like that. So I would think like, this is so frivolous. Like, this is so, why am I doing that? And I'm like, wait, like, I found great refuge in books during these past 2 years. So I had to think of it like that.
It is the healthiest coping mechanism when you go through the hardest times. If we think back to, the hardest times and just getting lost in a book and not having to think about your own heavy stuff for a while can be, like you said, I love that, the greatest refuge. Awesome. Well, where can we find you? I know you're M. Gable writer.
Yeah, M. Gable writer, so Gable writer on Twitter and Instagram. And my website's michellegable.com. And you can email me through that, or you can, I send out a newsletter. I don't send it out that often, maybe once a month, so it's not that much. I'm not as regular as I should be, but I also won't be inundating you. So yeah, either of those sites or my own site.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Okay, we'll just stand by 1 second. Everybody, go ahead and grab her newest book. You will love it. I went ahead and pulled it up on the carousel. Great book. And we will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.